Hey guys, welcome to another edition of Inside the FLX. I'm Josh Durso, and our program today begins along the northern shores of Seneca Lake, where the recently opened FLX Welcome Center has been making headlines for all the wrong reasons. A pair of investigative reports, one by WHEC in Rochester, the other by the Geneva Believer, spurred a major public discussion about transparency. To learn more about what's going on, we had Jim Meaney, founder of the Believer, in studio. He broke down the components and the FOIL requests that really made this story come to life. But before we get to that conversation, a word from today's show sponsor. And don't forget, Inside the FLX is available on iTunes as a podcast and airs weekly on Spectrum, channel 1304, WDWN 89.1 FM, and on FL1 radio. Stay tuned.
I was severely injured. I was on a ventilator. My husband was scared, and he just went for the nearest number that he had heard advertised over and over and figured they're the best. They know what they're doing. I think that's the typical reaction. But unfortunately, it wasn't the right one. And I'm thankful that we learned that early on in the process. He decided to look for someone locally who would give us a little more personalized attention. And when we met Steve and talked with him, we knew that we had found that person. If you want to feel like you have an attorney who's in your corner, who's going to listen to you, who's going to endeavor to understand you, give Steve a call. I really felt like everyone at Madej, Meares & Rickey really cared.
For a law firm that cares about you, contact Madej, Meares & Rickey at 315-568-0911. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome.
So Jim, welcome back to the program. Obviously a whole lot to talk about with the FLX Welcome Center at the northern end of Seneca Lake. You have done a lot of reporting on this, and a lot of people are concerned about the costs and the how and the who. How did we get here?
First, thanks for having me back. September 7th was the WHEC story out of Rochester. WHCC TV did some FOIL requests to look into where the money went and how the $5 million was spent on the FLX Welcome Center. What they found were a lot of items that seemed to be extremely overpriced. Bathroom signs for, I believe, $3,000 each. A picture frame that was $1,000, and a lot of other items that were seemed to be exorbitantly priced. So when that story came out, I had actually already been looking into Massa Construction's contracts with the city. Now, Massa Construction did part of the contract for the Welcome Center. The state was responsible for part of it. Massa Construction the state was responsible for part of it. The city of Geneva was responsible for part of it. And Massa Construction had done the city's half of the renovations on the building. So when the story came out with WHEC, I had already done a FOIL request that actually tied into the Welcome Center, and I already had some of the documentation on how the city's part of the process took place.
So obviously, and then the numbers started to reveal themselves. What were some of the really eye-opening numbers? Obviously, a bathroom sign worth $3,000, but there were some other pretty shocking, frankly, numbers that were thrown around and discussed. What is that telling us about the whole project?
Well, it's telling us that that the state clearly felt like they need. I don't know if the state felt like they needed to spend such an exorbitant amount of money, but one of the within the FOIL request from WHEC, there was one of the companies, the company that did a lot of the interior designing was a company out of, I believe they're based out of New York City, called Jack Morton. They're a global branding company. They do TV sets for The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, ESPN Sports Center, all these large corporations. They do that kind of work with big global corporations, CBS. I believe the canoe, there's some boats, there's some kayaks or canoes or something hanging from the ceiling, which were donated. That cost I don't remember, $50,000 to mount them on the ceiling. The sign for telling you that the canoes were donated was expensive. I don't recall all of the expenses, but it raised a lot of eyebrows because it's taxpayer money being used in a welcome center. I mean, it should be done well. It should be a place that people are. It should be eye-popping, but was it necessary to spend that much? Is the question, and I think that's why it got a lot of people's attention.
And what has been the reaction? Obviously, the WHEC report was the first one to hit the news waves, and then yours, which seemed to be operating in the background before the WHEC story even published. What was sort of the reaction from the community that you saw and experienced after your second report went up?
Well, the report that I went up, which tied in with WHEC, a lot of people were questioning, and a lot of people were concerned. Massive construction for years. I mean, ever since I moved to Geneva 6 years ago, it's one of those things that people talk about is why does Massa get all of these contracts? There's rumors and things like that about how it happens or why it happens. I'm not implying that there's anything illegal going on. It's just very curious when all of the biggest contracts always seem to go to the same company. So I think a lot of people were not only wanted to know more about what the state was doing, but also wanted to know how, once again, Massa Construction got this contract for $2.5 million to do the upgrades at the Welcome Center.
And it's interesting too, because you mentioned Massa Construction, and some folks might just be, who are listening to this, might just say, small communities tend to have a few large companies that handle a lot of these types of things. Why do you think there are parts of the community, at least, that don't believe it is just a simple matter of they happen to be the lowest bidder, or it's just nothing more than a coincidence?
I think probably because it's a small community. I think people just, if it were a larger city and you had one company getting these bids over and over and over, there would be the same kind of questions. But my second report, where I presented all the other information I got from the FOIL request for Massa Construction's contracts over the past 10 years, I think that made people feel a little more unsettled about it, because the city responded by saying that they couldn't find the documentation related to the bids. So we don't know, on $4 million in contracts that Massa had between 2008 and 2017, the city said they were unable to locate the documentation of who the other bidders were, how much it was, and how much Massa's bid was on those contracts. So it's when I got the FOIL request back, that was the most unusual FOIL request I've gotten from the city, because I've gotten a FOIL request related to the police. A lot of it was blacked out on the sheet. I understood that. There's certain information, but other than that, the city's been very forthcoming, and they've given me, hundreds of documents related to the foundry and other things. But this was the first one they said we can't find it, and especially when they couldn't find the bid information for the Welcome Center from just a year before. It doesn't necessarily mean there's something illegal going on, but it's very suspicious.
Does that raise another concern, separate from the possible, if it's a conflict of interest or something Insidious happening in the background, just kind of a concern about how did those documents just kind of disappear, if they really did, if they really are gone or not present? How does that happen in a process that involves the state and involves other agencies? Is that even possible?
It's confusing. And again, I don't know. I don't believe that they're necessarily not telling the truth and saying that they have the documents but they don't want to give them to me. I don't know if that's true. I kind of doubt that. But however it got to this point, however they got to the point where they can't easily and quickly pull up these documents and show them to anyone who asks. At the very least, it's some terrible bookkeeping. I mean, to the extent that it's, that's something that needs to be audited. There needs to be someone to come in and take a look and say, how are you keeping your books here? These aren't small contracts. These are $1 million contracts.
And the timing suggests that it isn't necessarily a product of current administration or current city management. Might have been a product or byproduct of the previous city manager's era. What kind of questions does that make you ask, since former city manager Matt Horn was viewed as probably one of the more organized and diligent city managers, even if some folks did disagree with the policy or the way he went about acting in some capacities?
Well, it brings up questions about how Matt Horn was running things, because as I posted in the blog, information that I got from multiple sources, including people who worked there, that Matt Horn would have breakfast with the owner of Massa Construction at Friendly's at 7 o'clock on Fridays every week. So when you see that kind of relationship between a city manager and a business person who also happens to be getting all these contracts routinely, and then one of the last things that Matt Horn did, he didn't do it. It was suggested by Councilor Grieco, was to give Nick Massa, the president of Massa, an award, a community award, at a city council meeting during one of the last city council meetings that Matt Horn was in charge of. It's this conflict of interest, appearance of a conflict of interest that's right out there in front of everyone, and there doesn't seem to be any concern to try to keep that a little more under wraps.
Interesting. Now, as far as the data goes that you have been foiling for, outsider, and I'm trying to think like somebody who may not live in Geneva but may care about what's going on in Geneva, or seeing this type of scenario play out elsewhere. Why isn't that kind of blow by blow data, since it's all inevitably on a PDF or in a Word document somewhere on a spreadsheet? Why isn't that information just released as projects are completed? And the sort of breakdown that way, it doesn't become a surprise 2 years later or 3 years later when people are saying, whoa, that door cost what?
Sure.
Right? Like, doesn't it seem kind of redundant to have to have the press or other entities request just basic dollars and cents information that the city or any municipal entity really shouldn't have any concern about releasing in the first place?
It really should, and that's the reason that I write the blog, and that's the reason that the blog resonates with so many people. It's just simple transparency. We want to know what you're doing. We want to know what our tax dollars are being used for. It wouldn't, and as you said, it wouldn't take very much time, and it wouldn't take very much effort just to say, here's what the bids were, and here's who won, and if you want to know more, here are the documents. Just have them out there and have it more public, and that's also why the Finger Lakes Times had in April, they had in their Finger Lakes Times Insider section, someone had sent in a question asking, why does Massa get all the projects? Well, if those bids and all those numbers were out there where people could see them and access them easily, there wouldn't be these questions, and then there wouldn't be the speculation.
Mm-hmm. Now, walk us through, obviously we're going to talk more about the press side of this story, in particular the Finger Lakes Times editorial board piece that came out maybe 2 or 3 months ago. Mm-hmm. But the split responsibility in terms of awarding the bids, I think some people might be a little bit confused about the where did the state stop and where did the city begin in terms of the construction, and who was basically deciding what through the construction of the Welcome Center.
I'm honestly not completely. I don't have a full understanding of all the moving parts of the Welcome Center contract, but I from my understanding, the state was responsible for a lot of the interior design and some other aspects of the renovating the Welcome Center, which was actually the Geneva Visitor Center on the lakefront, owned by the city and run by the city before. Massa Construction was hired as a general contractor by the city of Geneva to do many of the renovations. I believe mostly on the building. I'm not exactly sure how it breaks down, who built the playground, who built the waterfall outside. I do know that Massa did a large amount of the renovations within the building, putting down the beautiful floor that's in there, and all of the the rooms and those kind of things.
Mm-hmm. Now, for some people, they might be saying this feels like a lot of the other city issues where we're talking about transparency, we're talking about certain details being left out, whether it's intentional or unintentional. For those folks, what do you say to them, just in terms of what it requires to actually create change? Because it seems like every time we have you in and we start talking about one of these issues, it comes down to, well, if people want to see change, they actually have to get out and be involved with said change. Is this really that similar? Is this particular instance that similar to all of the other issues that folks have been seeing play out for the last 3, 4, 5 years in Geneva?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe it still goes back to the same thing: transparency, accountability, being open, and like I've also said before, I can write about anything on the blog that I want to, and if nobody responds to it, it's just a guy writing stories on a blog. Until the public actually sees it, responds, goes to city council, tells them what they want to see, tells them that they want more transparency, tells them that they need to do things differently, and votes that way as well. And then it comes down to who's running for council and asking them those questions. And city council holds a lot of responsibility in all of this. We can blame, a clerk who didn't keep the records correctly, or we can blame a city manager for not being open about things. But they all work for city council. They work for the people. And city council works for the people, and then all of the city works for city council. So it all comes back again to city council.
Are we any closer to what you feel like is a tipping point, or just judging from that pulse of the community, which you undoubtedly have? What do you think it would take, or are we already there to a point where you think a majority of folks in Geneva are finally getting to that stage where they're saying, okay, I have to get involved, I have to do something, even if it's just attending a meeting or reading the blog or just being more informed, I have to do something?
I think we're already there. I think there's going to be a lot more. I'm very excited to see what happens with the next city council election. I think there's going to be a lot more people involved, a lot more people wanting to run, for each party. There may be multiple candidates, there might be primaries. A lot of people are really focusing on city council now, because I'm hoping that people are understanding more that how much influence and power the city council has. Sometimes I'm concerned that there might be sort of a fatigue when I come there, a corruption fatigue, or whatever you want to call it, when I put out these stories over and over and people keep seeing them, and sometimes people's reaction is this is just the way Geneva is. It's never going to change. But I don't think that that's going to be. I don't think that that's going to stay with people. I'm hoping, and I believe that as we get closer to election season, even in the spring, when people start deciding who's going to run, that kind of stuff, people are going to get more involved and understand that these kind of changes could happen very quickly with a new city council that cares about transparency and accountability.
And I think lost on some folks maybe is the depth of the reporting that you've been, that the Believer blog has been pushing out. You can't just dump everything in one story. You can't just, especially, we were talking before we came on a little bit about the extent of coverage of the police department in Geneva. These things have to be covered over a long period of time because it has to be done that way. Is that sort of, I guess my real question in terms of the blog is it making people warm up a little more to the concept of it takes a little work to be informed and, to really know your stuff about these issues?
I would like to hope it is. I get messages all the time from people who didn't realize things that were going on, or they ask, what can be done, or is this just the way it is? Yeah, and it's and like you said, it's a long game. I mean, a lot of these stories that I write about, they come out of nowhere, and I have to write about them. And I've asked, some people will say, when are you going to stop? I say, well, when they stop doing things, when they stop pulling these stunts, so to speak, where another thing happens that I feel like needs to be examined a little more closely. So yeah, it's a never-ending thing. I would love to get to a point where I'm not writing just about City Hall's missteps.
Yeah, so I think in the interesting segue, because I did want to talk about the media landscape part of this, because that was a part of your story about this whole contract issue and the Welcome Center. What role, through your encounter so far, has the Times, the Finger Lakes Times, played in this whole issue? Obviously, they had the insider piece earlier this year, and then there was an editorial board piece that ran beginning of summer or late spring. And now we're here, and there hasn't really been much in between. Now, I can attest to, as being a person in the media and knowing what these traditional outlets are going through, newsrooms aren't getting bigger. So I'm sympathetic to that side of it. But what was your take, and what did you find as you were going through this process of what the Times was either intentionally or inadvertently doing through their coverage of this issue?
Well, when the insider story came out in April, I felt like it was they did what they needed to do. They contacted the city comptroller, and they said, what are the numbers and who bid on this? And he told them, and they asked him, why does Massa get all the bids? And he replied, because they're the lowest bidder every time. That's all well and good, but it felt like it was something that I've seen the Finger Lakes Times do in the past, where there's a controversial issue, so they ask a city official what the answer is. The city official tells them the answer, and then that seems to be the end of the story. I'm never comfortable with that. I understand, and I know some people at the Finger Lakes Times. I think the Finger Lakes Times has tremendous value in the Finger Lakes. There's a lot of stories and information that they cover, and I do believe that we need them as part of our life and as part of our media landscape. But there's, when you're talking about whether it's an issue with not having enough staff, or whether it's an issue with having a small city where personal and professional relationship, the lines are blurred, that the Finger Lakes Times may not push things as far as maybe they should, as their role should be, watchdog of the establishment. So that story, their first article about Massa, I understood where they were coming from, but didn't seem to go in too deeply. But as you know, the editorial kind of set me off a little bit, because I thought it was. So
what is for those who didn't read it, who didn't read the editorial itself, give us sort of the overview of what was being said, or what the message was that got, and you weren't the only one who was concerned about this. I was reading it on social media for like a week after your actual story ran about it. It sort of reminded people, I guess, about what was going on. So give us a sort of idea of what essentially the message was in that editorial piece.
Well, the editorial piece was called Let's Welcome the Welcome Center. And the gist of the story was that although people have questions about Massa getting all these big contracts, those people are cynics, and they're always going to find fault. And what they should do is go down, take a look at the Welcome Center, see what a great thing it is for Geneva, see how nice it is, and somehow that would make them think differently about these questions that they have about why this one company seems to get an inordinate number of contracts. The tone of the article, as I wrote in the blog, it felt very demeaning and very dismissive of people who have these kind of questions. It didn't say that people have valid questions. It didn't even imply that these questions were valid or should be answered. And the fact that it was not just a column written by a columnist, but this was the editorial board. This is the official position of the newspaper. I saw, when you and Jackie were talking about on the debrief, and how you said that was a very risky thing for a newspaper to do, to take this stance on this issue, where they may not have looked into it far enough, and they may not have done the kind of research that they should do before they try to distract people and say, oh, just go look at the Welcome Center, and then you're not gonna, then you won't be so concerned about any possibility of conflicts of interest.
Yeah, and I think, just sort of piggybacking off of that, full disclosure, I also have a column in the Finger Lakes Times. Know a lot of folks up there, great people, good people. I think their intent is correct. Mm-hmm. But going back to the whole idea of an editorial board opinion, I think we're not in that climate anymore where that's possible. At least not without alienating or raising concerns or having somebody yell from the corner fake news. That's just, mm-hmm. Sadly, that's kind of where we are right now. So my point there was just that I don't really see the purpose anymore, or unless not the purpose, maybe the good that can come from it. Especially when you're talking about a situation here where it seems like not enough was done investigating, and if that wasn't something that could be done by the Finger Lakes Times for staffing or any other reasons, then that should have been something that they just let go and allow the folks who write letters to the editor and things like that sort of dictate what that conversation was all about. But I will say this, one part of it, or I should say different parts of it, felt a little bit demeaning toward folks like you who do a lot of this watchdog reporting. So you're pretty focused on the city of Geneva, and obviously right now you'd like to be focused on some other things in Geneva, but yeah. You're watching City Hall. So in a lot of ways, you're sort of the watchdog group of City Hall. Did it feel personal, or does it ever feel personal when you have some of the larger, more traditional outlets sort of maybe not intentionally taking a swipe, but just sort of by their tone sort of dismissing what folks like you are doing?
Yeah, I mean, when I read that article, they had another editorial, I think a month later, about the Geneva BID's deal with a local car dealership to get a truck to use. When they talk about people who are, I do take it personally. I do think that maybe they're talking about me. I don't like to say that too much, because then people say, oh, you think it's all about you. But I think that the blog, and then the readers who do read the blog and who do ask the same kind of questions, it does feel like it's kind of a swipe at me. It doesn't bother me that much, because I know that means that I'm doing the right thing. If I'm getting under people's skin, whether it's the newspaper or City Hall, and also to go back to that editorial, what they sort of conflated the two issues of questions about the money and the contracts and whether the Welcome Center looks like a cool place. I mean, I think the Welcome Center is it's eye-popping when you go in there. I love the place. Plus, I can go in there and I can get Geneva Lake Creamery ice cream anytime I want. I don't have to drive 35 minutes to Interlaken, and they're not paying me to say that. But if they want to send me free ice cream, send some to Josh too. We'll accept that as well. I have integrity, but I do have my
also
price.
A sweet tooth.
We all have our price. So yeah, it's when the Finger Lakes Times does say those kind of things, and when they talk about cynics and those kind of things, I do take it personally. But I know that means we're doing something good.
So as far as progress in Geneva, you feel things are going in the right direction as far as getting more folks engaged, getting more people to talk about these issues and think about them. What do you see for this debate in particular, as far as the Welcome Center goes? What's next, or I guess what can folks expect over the next couple months? Obviously, as the numbers continue to sink in and people start to realize, what exactly was invested.
I'm really not sure. I know that WHEC filed a FOIL request for more information, more details than I asked for regarding the Welcome Center and what in the city's part of the Welcome Center. So I don't know what that's going to bring. I'm not really sure. Like sometimes when these issues come up, there have been things I've written about that seem to be explosive, and a lot of people talk about them, and it's an issue that's on everyone's mind for a couple of weeks, and then they're just on to the next issue. I don't know. I would like to think that this will prompt and this will push residents to ask the city for more openness with these kind of bids. I would imagine that next time there's a $500,000 or $1 million construction bid that's up in the city, that they're going to be more careful with their paperwork. Yeah, I don't know. People might stop talking about this next week. There might be something else that comes up that's more salacious or what have you. But I hope it's something that at least people don't forget about.
And I have to ask, piggybacking sort of off our discussion about the media side of this, obviously WHEC runs the story first. They break it, so to speak, and then you do the follow-up. But those two investigative pieces, even though they're pretty equal in terms of what's being said and asserted, can be received very differently and can be viewed very differently. Does it concern you at all on the media side of it that a WHEC report might be taken a little more seriously or might be looked at differently through a different lens compared to what the Believer published, because it may feel to some like it's more activism than it is journalism, even though that's clearly not the case. What you guys are doing over there is awesome and incredibly important. How does that sort of feel to you, especially when they're so close together? The WHEC was, I think, 2 or 3 days before your story published, accomplishing the same thing, but that reception's different, right?
Yeah, it is. But frankly, I don't feel like I have any kind of adversarial relationship with the media. I was extremely happy to see WHEC put that story out, because that gave me the opportunity on the Massa story that I had already been working on. I said, oh, they're already looking at this. So now we can have people. They're looking. The WHEC focused mostly on the ridiculous cost that people were paying,
right?
And my story focused more on how was the bid awarded. So I mean, I don't feel like there's that much of a difference. I know people are going to perceive it differently, and that's fine. Because I know that the work that I'm doing, although sometimes it might be a little bit irreverent, or sometimes there might be a little more, sarcasm, and sometimes I certainly insert some of my opinions occasionally in some of the stories. But that's my role, and that's what I'm doing, and it's working so far, and yeah, that's.
So the Believer, remind our listeners where they can find you. Obviously, the website. You're on social, Facebook, I believe. Walk us through where and how they can find you.
You can find me at GenevaBeliever.com. All the stories are there, going back the last 2+ years. You can also find Geneva Believer on Facebook at facebook.com/Geneva Believer.
All right. Well, I appreciate you coming in, taking the time. Obviously, keep up the good work, and I'm sure we'll be seeing you back here soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me again.
Thanks, Jim.